Welcome to Forever Saroyan Presents 3x3 with your host, Christopher J. Garcia.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Forever Saroyan Presents 3x3. This time we're looking at the story, Public Speech. And I think Saroyan sums it up pretty perfectly with the opening lines of his introduction. This one's goofy, but even so, some readers may get a kick out of it. The story is actually a little bit difficult to sum up. It's a speech. At least that's the form of it. But it's not a typical speech as we might think of it. It's both a character study and, in a strange way, a commentary on everything from communism to socialism to art to politics to the progression of life itself. And it features both the text of the speech and then, in parentheses, comments of what's going on inside the world in which a speech is being given. The opening of the actual piece goes like this. Ladies, gentlemen, patriots, lovers of opera, enemies of Russia, soldiers, workers, fascists, Presbyterians, Rotarians, Greeks, Jews, orators, farmers, mechanics, gamblers, sons of America, daughters of the revolution, rebels, sailors, taxpayers, voters, students, Catholics, worshippers of Stalin, black shirts, Mr. President, Mrs. President, brown shirts, doctors, nurses, poets, writers, composers, and critics of life and literature. And then in parentheses, swig of whiskey. From that very opening, you can tell that Saroyan is writing for this universal person. In essence, he's doing what he does often. He is trying to be as egalitarian as possible in his writing. You're often mentioning groups that would be typically diametrically opposed to one another. The addition of Mr. President, Mrs. President, an interesting note, but strange. A majority of the speech is about Mark Lazansky, and he's 20, born in Russia, Jewish, and a strapping young lad. What's strange is that as the piece goes on, the thread gets lost, and it's on purpose. That's what's so fascinating about it. It is something of a ramble, but at the same time, it is pointedly making use of a number of techniques that Saroyan often used. The parentheticals to indicate action, such as swig of whiskey, which is repeated throughout this and may also explain some of the rambling nature of it. The giving a full backstory of a character within almost snapshots, vignettes almost. For example, when talking about the birth of Mark Lazansky, he says the following. Brothers and sisters, the day of his birth was a cold day in New York. Snow everywhere. The little flat on Mulberry Street was dark and frozen like the mind of a homeless man walking the streets through a winter night, black and cold. Poor Mama Lazansky groaned in her bed, frightened and sorry she had ever come to America. 1,000 agonies in Moscow would have been better. That's where it gets interesting, because at this point, it is about the character. But then it moves on. It talks about sort of the American Republic and the experiment. It talks about using characters such as John D. Rockefeller, J.P. Morgan, Andrew Mellon, the richest people in America at that point. And they play characters. In this case, he cast them as thieves, the three tycoons. And it's funny because they were sort of seen as robber barons at the time, but they're also some of the most respected men in America. They were often the target of young socialists and communists who were making statements about how American inequality had grown greatly in the 1920s and 30s. What's interesting is that throughout this, there are full of repetition and lists, which is something that occasionally Saroyan is pretty well known for. He also continually refers to the audience as brothers or brethren, as if he's addressing a group that he is a part of. And when he made that initial mention of all the people he was speaking to, there's no single group they would all really be members of, except for perhaps America as a whole. But at the same time, it is definitely bifurcated. He is in many ways railing against the rich, the pompous. In a way, he's also going against organization in general. There's a wonderful passage that I think is really just brilliantly done. I tell you, my friends, there is no hope for the living. None. None whatsoever. Though Catholic children pray from morning till night, And novelists fill the world with book after book, and painters paint, and actors act, and preachers preach. And so help me if you think the world is not ending, if you think the very sky is not falling, if you think chaos is not coming. Comrades, you are gaga, your eyes are blind, your ears are deaf, your nose is clogged, your limbs frozen, and your hearts decayed. Parenthetically, applause. Professors, educators, plumbers and pipefitters, newsboys, beggars, and Arthur Brisbane, now is the time to rise and laugh. I said rise and laugh, my friends. Victim. I said no laughter. Anger. What's brilliant about that specific segment is, again, he's listing different groups, different activities, and treating them all with an equalness. The prayers of a Catholic, the writer writing, the painter painting, the preacher preaching, all of them in the same context. What's funny is we see an echo of one of his stories that he had done in Inhale and Exhale, which was reprinted in The Gay and Melancholy Fluxus Ben, a story called 666, in which he moves it directly to the listener and uses a very familiar form. You are 12 years old and alive. Follow closely. The long day ended and you are still an Italian living in Rome, 20 years old. Came Mussolini with the loud mouth, ha-ha. Came oratory, came the salute, came the word fascism. You agree to live in Italy because you were born in Italy and like the climate, and because you have Italian memories. Lo and behold, you are a fascist, but not actually and not with a bang bang. The change, statistical and not organic. Your name is Thomas Mazza, and what the hell do you care what they say you? The repeated use of came Mussolini, came fascist, so on and so forth, very much echoed what the majority of Ben, or 666, is and does. It is a form that Saroyan uses to indicate the importance of connection to time. As he adds a thing and then said came, what he is really saying is, this happened. This was a moment. This was a noted event that must be paid attention to. Consequently, when he says you, when he addresses a specific idea of a being, a you, he is using it, of course, universally. But at the same time, he is saying that any specificity that we apply to any one person in this world is applicable to everybody. It's strange how this flows out from there. And again, echoing the way that Ben and 666 tell the story of the passage of history and its impact on the individuals who are there now. We see that same technique in a slightly different way. Read your evening newspaper. Yawn and speak of the news. Toots! I see by the paper where 5,000 Ethiopians were killed today by a bunch of Italians. Baby, them foreigners are gaga. The scene changes. The Americans are coming. The Mexicans are coming. The South Americans are coming. And here come the British with a bang bang. Again, it is these references that show import. And here talking about the colonization aspects of the world, about how scarcity and need has always driven the idea of conquest. That's here in many, many ways. I think that the most confusing part of this is that Saroyan seems to want an end to human suffering in many different ways, but notably financially. Of course, in the introduction, talking about how he wanted to live long enough to see everyone be a millionaire, to be made comfortable. But he often thumbs his nose at ideas of communism, socialism, and religion, very much so. He speaks against the rich, but at the same time, he clearly admires their lifestyle, not only because of how he personally lives, but how he is constantly noting their most important figure. In essence, it seems he is aspiring to be a rich man, but doesn't like the people who already live in that neighborhood. This push-pull, attraction-repulsion concept makes this story in particular very difficult to put into a single framework. Now, one thing that I've sort of thought of this, because it does sort of, I wouldn't say fall apart as it goes, but it definitely changes shape and scope, are the asides of a sip of whiskey, a sip of gin. Could it be that the speaker is getting more and more drunk and himself is losing the thread? That would be a very generous reading, and also one that I could see Saroyan going with. At the same time, there is certainly a focus on the idea that the world is going in a wrong direction. And perhaps there is subtext that says the world is coming towards a reckoning. That could well be. But Saroyan himself said this story was goofy, but some may like it. The goofy aspect is clear. There's a lot of comedy here. And the funny thing is that it's actually more comedic now because it's come to a time which is more like the time he is describing than the time he was describing at the time. When he talks about the idea of patriotism as being a difficult aspect of his life, that's truly key. But I think in the same way he approaches patriotism, something that he definitely did have, and if you read him writing about America in general, he does have this joyous acceptance of being an American, at the same time as being highly critical of America itself and Americans. I think the contradictions within the existence of many of Saroyan's work exist because he himself was conflicted as to his own role in the world. He wants success, but he doesn't like the successful. Perhaps it's a way of him saying he's glad he doesn't have more success. But at this point in his career, he was pretty dang successful. He had cash. He had cachet. But the question is, what did he view that as meaning? And in many, many ways, I think that this story is him saying that his success doesn't mean much. That though he may personify himself as the speaker in this, I truly think he is the speaker who is using Mark Lazansky as a stand-in for himself. In essence, he's doing what he did with his own writing in The Living and the Dead. He has stepped outside of himself to look at himself and provide a view at that as a somewhat objective observer. He gives Lazansky a backstory to make it less obvious. But in many ways, I think Saroyan was describing what his ideal self was or would have been at that point. And that makes it a very interesting connection with the rest of his work. Thanks for listening to Forever Saroyan Presents 3x3. I'm your host, Chris Garcia. Hope you'll stay tuned for our next episode, Life and Letters. Thanks for listening.